Okay, so the Houston Texans, how did this even happen? How did we end up at a point where for 3 years straight, the Texans have devolved into nothing more than a glorified doormat for the rest of the NFL? This was a team that at several points in time fielded countless rosters overflowing with talent, but even with that being true, they always struggled to win anything at all and never earned any respect around the league. So let's dive deep into how the Texans overcame the odds and almost reached the top of the mountain only to spiral out of control, making every wrong possible choice to end up as the abandoned, desolated team we see today. We start on the beautiful day that was October 6th, 1999, the day the Houston Texans were officially born. But even with their franchise's creation, it ended up taking 3 whole years for the Texans to be able to officially play NFL games, as they first had to name the team and get a stadium ready, but once that was done, finally ahead of the 2002 season, the NFL world would officially be introduced to the Houston Texans. But before we get into the meat, after the 2001 season concluded, it was announced that the 2 men who hold the future for Houston would be head coach Dom Capers and general manager Charlie Casserly, and immediately these dudes, as well as the rest of the staff, were given a ton of homework to do, as just around the corner before the official NFL draft was the NFL expansion draft, where the Texans had a golden opportunity to get their stubby fingerprints all over an immediately impactful player. So, with 5 available players from every NFL team, the Texans went through and grabbed who they believed to be the most valuable assets available, as with their first selection, the Texans drafted Jaguars Hall of Fame tackle Tony Boselli, and with their second pick, they nabbed Ryan Young, a 25-year-old right guard away from the New York Jets. So, now that the Texans had some sort of a makeshift offensive line, they would then use their first overall pick in the real NFL draft to pick up the consensus #1 overall college player in the country, as the Houston Texans made Fresno State quarterback David Carr the first draft pick in Texans history. At this point, all was well in Houston, as they were set to have their young future leader and star quarterback be firmly protected behind one of the best offensive linemen in NFL history, and another solid enough tackle as well, except there were a few major complications. For starters, although Tony Boselli was a monster for the Jaguars, in his final season in Duval, Tony only played in 3 games on the entire season, dealing with a chronic shoulder injury that would unfortunately require surgery. And Tony Boselli decided to get the surgery as a member of the Jaguars, and that was all fine, except for the issue was that the surgery went horribly wrong, and Tony was now in excruciating pain 24/7 as a member of the Texans. And as time went on, it became clear that Tony Boselli wouldn't play a single game for the Texans in the 2002 season and would retire from the NFL 1 year later, never suiting up for even a single game in a Texans uniform. And then for another right jab to the gut, their second round selection in the expansion draft, good old Ryan Young, ended up tearing his groin during training camp and wasn't ready to start the season, meaning that the Texans' rookie quarterback, who had never played a snap in the NFL, was going to be playing professional football behind an offensive line made of plumbers and guys who weren't even supposed to be playing football in the first place. But the Texans organization didn't care at all, and David Carr in his rookie year was set up to be nothing more than a blood sacrifice. And sure enough, the Texans ended up not only being a terrible football team, but they absolutely ravaged their young quarterback for the future.
The other to open the third, and they tied the game at 17-0. Now David Carr against a big rush just hammered it. Now he stands in. They got him twice.
76 times. David Carr, as a 23-year-old in his first year in the big leagues, was sacked an NFL record 76 times throughout the course of the year, as the Houston Texans would finish with a putrid 4-12 record, the first of many unwatchable seasons under Dom Capers and the rest of the crew. And to be honest, it pretty much only got worse from here, as for the next 3 seasons, Big Dom Capers led the least motivated men in football to a downright atrocious 14-34 record, and if you couldn't put all the puzzle pieces together, this all led to Dom Capers getting fired by the Texans and general manager Charlie Casserly resigning just a few months later, as the two left very little behind other than one broken quarterback and one massive load of pure disappointment. But hey, it wasn't all that bad though, I guess, as over the years, the Texans had begun to at least bring in a few semi-decent NFL players, and above all, the Texans had a true superstar wide receiver in Andre Johnson, who they picked up with the 3rd pick in the 2003 NFL draft, and the newly acquired Mario Williams, who they drafted 1st overall in the 2006 NFL draft. And the guys who brought in Mario Williams and helped ring in the new era of Texans football were general manager Rick Smith and head coach Gary Kubiak, 2 men who would rebuild the Houston Texans into a real NFL team for the first time in their franchise's existence. The first thing Gary and Rick did was clean house, firing damn near everyone, not only hiring a brand new offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator, but they replaced their entire positional coaches as well with basically the entire future 2019 49ers coaching staff, bringing in Kyle Shanahan, Mike McDaniel, retaining the previously interned Robert Saleh, and even drafting DeMeco Ryans in the 2nd round of the 2006 NFL draft to hopefully start building something resembling a football team. So the 2006 Texans season officially began, and it started off like your average Texans season, as they were annihilated for the first 3 weeks of the season, and didn't really get better from there either, as besides a great rookie season by both DeMeco Ryans and Mario Williams, as well as the usual dominant top 5 wide receiver play from Andre Johnson, who owned a majority of the wide receiver statistics this season, but besides that, nothing really went their way. Other than their offensive improvement from 0 to like a 4 or 5 out of 10, the Texans' biggest highlight from this season was beating the Colts for the first time in franchise history on a last-second field goal 27-24 as they defeated the eventual Super Bowl champions this season. Somehow, I guess. Now, this 2006 season would also be David Carr's last in Houston, as he would cement himself as one of the greatest draft busts in the modern NFL, being forever known as the guy who was sacked 76 times in 1 year, and that's kinda it. So, good work taking care of your quarterback, Houston. So with David Carr now free from his crusty torture chamber, for the next 4 years, the Houston Texans under Gary Kubiak stayed stagnant, as they finally had their first winning season in 2009 with a 9-7 record, but even when the team had a good-ish season, they were never considered as anything remotely close to a real threat in the AFC. And although the Texans had actually begun to accumulate more talent on top of just Andre Johnson, as they had an all-pro running back in his prime with Arian Foster, and David Carr's replacement quarterback Matt Schaub was actually pretty good. So although all of these new shiny toys were great, the offense was never really the issue for the Texans in these early years, as the other side of the ball continued to hold Houston back from reaching their full potential. The Houston Texans defense was real bad, and as you can see, not only were they bad in 2010, but every single year since defensive coordinators Richard Smith and later Frank Bush started getting access to the stove, the Texans were not only below league average at everything defensively, but were consistently cooking brand new ways up to hold back a legitimately good Houston offense. So here we are, the Texans' 2010-2011 offseason, and at this point, the Texans were just a mess. But above all that, the one thing they needed was an experienced, strong leader who could turn a terrible defense into at least an okay-ish one, and the Texans ended up getting exactly that. Wade Phillips came to save the Texans franchise for the first and only time since its inception, and immediately after the 2010 season ended, Frank Bush was tossed to the curb, and on January 5th, 2011, the Houston Texans hired defensive coordinator Wade Phillips, the man who would change everything for the Texans. Now, with Wade Phillips co-captaining the SS Trash Can, the first thing that needed to be done to build a solid defense was to bring in talent. So the Houston Texans went out and did just that, as they ended up picking up a Pro Bowl reliable cornerback in Jonathan Joseph from the Bengals in free agency, and most importantly, with the 11th selection in the 2011 NFL Draft, the Houston Texans drafted J.J. Watt, the greatest Houston Texan to ever put on the jersey. So with talent still all over the place on offense, with Andre Johnson and Arian Foster ready to torch defenses, as well as a Texans team stacked with a very solid, if not great, O-line led by guys like Dwayne Brown and Chris Myers, the stage was set for a special season. And what we got was the greatest season the Texans organization had to date, and the birth of the Houston Texans as, dare I say, a real formidable NFL franchise.
It's shot to James Casey from the 6. Looking end zone, fires, touchdown!
It finally happened. After 9 years of existing in the NFL ecosystem, doing nothing but fending off of the scraps from other teams, the Houston Texans broke the drought, going 10-6 on the season, and made the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. And on their road to their first ever playoff spot, the Texans had a stretch of games from week 7 through week 14 where they didn't lose a single game and looked like arguably one of the better teams in the entire NFL. Except if we look a little deeper, everything wasn't all sunshines and rainbows. All season long, the Texans were ravaged by, I guess, the curse of Tony Boselli, as a ton of players dealt with pretty bad injuries, including Andre Johnson, who missed 9 games with multiple hamstring injuries, Arian Foster, who missed multiple games primarily due to a left hamstring injury, and most importantly, their starting quarterback Matt Schaub, the engine of the best Texans team we've seen so far, suffered a Lisfranc foot injury in week 10, ending his season. So with the whole team slowly succumbing to the scourge, in stepped career backup and rookie quarterback TJ Yates to finish the season out for Houston, and he helped the Texans drop their final 3 games of the season to limp into their first ever playoff game. But because of their weak division, the Texans were able to host their battle against the Cincinnati Bengals in the wildcard round. Now, the Bengals were actually pretty similar to the now wounded Texans, as both teams were led by rookie quarterbacks in a young red squirt gun and the aforementioned Yates. But as the game began on the NFL's biggest stage in the playoffs, the Texans proved even when they were bruised and battered beyond repair, this team had heart, which helped produce undoubtedly the greatest play in Texans history.
Batted down and intercepted. Intercepted by J.J. Watt. Touchdown, Houston.
This one moment was the textbook definition of a franchise-defining play, as JJ's intercepted pass turned out to be the turning point in this game, as the Texans used that momentum to cruise to a 31-10 victory, stopping Cincinnati from putting any more numbers on the board for the rest of the game. So they had done it. The Texans had now won their first playoff game in franchise history, but that would be as far as this wounded animal could go, as there was a clear food chain in the AFC this year, and with the Texans not even close to full strength, they would fall to the Ravens by just a single score, with TJ Yates playing some just putrid football, almost single-handedly losing the game by himself. And with that, the curtains closed on the Texans' 2011 season, and man, what a year. If it weren't for all the injuries that happened throughout the season, this team really could have made a deep playoff run. But above all that, the most impressive thing this season was the defensive improvement, as under Wade Phillips, this Houston defense went from the 29th ranked defense in the NFL in 2010 all the way up to the 4th overall defense in 2011. And as you can see, they absolutely suffocated opposing offenses every Sunday afternoon. But perhaps there were cracks beginning to form in the Texans' armor, as to start things off, the 2012 offseason was pretty crappy as they watched two of their best defensive players in franchise history walk away from the team, as both DeMeco Ryans and Mario Williams fled Houston for good, leaving behind gargantuan holes in their places. Add those two crushing departures onto the fact that people weren't exactly confident in the 245 pounds of raw sex appeal that was Matt Schaub to be back to 100% form after his foot injury, and it seemed like the writing was already all over the wall that the Houston Texans were destined to fall back down to earth. Now, yeah, that very easily could have happened, but it didn't. And to start the 2012 season, Texans fans couldn't have dreamed of a better start to the year, as through the first 4 games of the season, the Texans were on top of the NFL world, as Houston's Big Three was firing on all cylinders, as the Texans won these games by an average of 17.5 points, which was great, but more importantly in this small sample size, one human-like creature named J.J. Watt emerged as arguably the NFL's best player, period, as the man found himself leading the NFL in sacks by the 4th week of the season and only thirsted for more blood as the year went on. And even after dismantling their division rival in the Titans in week 4, it somehow only got better from there, as for the rest of the season, the Texans won a whopping 6 games in a row and only lost 4 games total, with 3 of those L's coming in the final 4 weeks of the season. So with the 2012 Texans regular season coming to a close, it seems like Houston clinching a playoff appearance is now just a normal thing, as with Matt Schaub, Arian Foster, and Andre Johnson all making Pro Bowls and having fantastic seasons again while also being healthy, and with J.J. Watt still dominating, even winning the Defensive Player of the Year award in his sophomore campaign, this was finally looking like the year where the Houston Texans sling some meat around and make a run for the crown in the AFC. Their first opponent in the playoffs was the Cincinnati Bengals. Again, we're really doing this again, huh? Marvin Lewis and the Bengals' incompetence aside, this game started out ugly for both sides, as the Texans only managed 3 field goals while Andy Dalton threw for a blazing -6 yards in the first half. So after that heart-pounding first half, the game continued to stay close, but the only issue was the severe lack of good football actually being played, as after just barely missing AJ Green on what could have been a game-winning touchdown, the Texans limped to a victory 19-13 and advanced to the divisional round to face their next opponent. The team that was waiting for the Texans, sitting comfortably with their first round bye, was of course the inevitable New England Patriots led by Aaron Hernandez. But more importantly, after whatever the hell the Bengals game was, people began to realize this Texans team may have more red flags than we initially thought. See, looking back at their regular season games, although their 12-4 record looks impressive on paper, only 4 out of those 12 victories actually came against teams with a winning record, and although they did prove they were worthy against the eventual Super Bowl champion Ravens, when they faced against teams with previous Super Bowl DNA, they got shellacked, getting erased by both the Packers and the Patriots. So with these glaring holes looking a lot more noticeable, the NFL world really should have seen what happened next coming.
Flips it to Shane Vereen, walking in all by himself.
Look, if you were going to beat the Patriots in the 2010s, not only did you have to be talented and a little lucky, but you had to capitalize on every single opportunity given to you. And the Texans failed to do that on multiple occasions in this game, but the most egregious example was on the literal first drive of the game, when the Texans had the ball just outside the 10 after a long kickoff return, and they blew back-to-back plays in a row with a drop and an overthrow to miss their chance at first blood. Simply put, if you hesitate against the best, you're going to pay, as the Patriots took advantage and jumped out to a 38-13 lead and never looked back, and the Texans lost the game 41-28 in the divisional round for the second year in a row. Another tough loss, but still, at least the Texans were good, and the front office, led by longtime general manager Rick Smith, still believed that this core was good enough to win now, and he reinforced that belief by adding some more good football players as they signed Ed Reed's withered remains away from Baltimore and drafted some guy named DeAndre Hopkins in the 2013 draft. So, the Texans reloaded. Same coaches, same offense, and to start the 2013 season, everything was going pretty damn well, all things considered, as the Texans started out 2-0, taking down the Chargers and Titans respectively. And hell, things were even going so well, Ed Reed, who had yet to play a game with the Texans at this point, still felt confident enough to say that he was going to help bring the Texans a Super Bowl ring this year. But instead of that happening, the Texans took a dark turn and fell off a cliff harder than you could possibly imagine.
It's intercepted by Richard Sherman!
Yep, you see it, I see it. There's no point in hiding it at all. The 2013 Texans were awful again, and the team lost every single game for the remainder of the season after week 2. But to explain this, I don't even know where to start. I mean, on the surface, things don't even look that bad, as Andre Johnson and DeAndre Hopkins were one of the most dangerous wide receiver duos in the entire league this year. And of course, J.J. Watt continued to be unstoppable, so how could a team with this much talent go from 12-4 1 year ago to falling off this hard? Remember Matt Schaub, the Texans quarterback or whatever? Well, this season, he just decided to be horrible. I physically cannot express to you how downright nausea-inducing Matt Schaub's so-called quarterback play was in 2013, as his stats on the season were... they just didn't look real in the worst possible way. And these stats still don't paint the picture for just how disastrous his play was during this season. By just week 5 of the 2013 season, Matt Schaub had set a damn near unbreakable record, allowing 4 pick sixes in 4 straight games. And after a fan confronted the man at his own home and an injury later, Matt Schaub would play on and off for a few more games that year, but more or less, his time in the NFL as a Houston Texan was no more. But before the season even ended, the Texans decided it was finally time to move on from their second coach in franchise history, and Houston fired Gary Kubiak, as the man had done his duty of bringing the Texans to relevance and maybe had overstayed his welcome by just a little bit. So, with Kubiak gone, the head coaching seat was empty, and with that, this story is now going to go in an interesting direction, as allow me to introduce you to the one and only former Patriots offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach, Bill O'Brien, the new head coach of the Houston Texans, and also the hero and the villain of this story from now on. Now, with Bill O'Brien running the show, just as Gary Kubiak once did, O'Brien scrubbed the house of any bacteria and replaced most of the coaches from 2013 with guys that he trusted, like Romeo Crennel to be the defensive coordinator and Mike Vrabel to coach the linebackers, both of these guys being former Patriots, of course. So with a whole new coaching cast in place, the next step was to find a new quarterback in a market that was headlined by a 34-year-old Michael Vick and Josh McCown, but the Texans had no choice and went dumpster diving, coming up with Ryan Fitzpatrick on a 2-year deal and trading for none other than former Patriots quarterback Ryan Mallett to trade off on running the show. Besides those two, the Texans really didn't bring in anyone else of impact except for one more guy, sort of. As remember, the Texans just finished a 2-14 campaign, so they were awarded with the first overall pick in the 2014 NFL Draft and selected one of the best defensive prospects we've ever seen in Jadeveon Clowney. And pairing a young Clowney with the current best defensive player in the NFL, it looked like this duo of JJ and Jadeveon could haunt the NFL for years. But for now, those hopes had to be put on hold, because as the 2014 season began, in the first game of the season, Jadeveon Clowney tore his meniscus and was out for the next 6 weeks, and this would only be the beginning of his battles with injuries. Anyways, at the midway point in the Texans' 2014 season, they found themselves meddling in mediocrity once more with a 4-5 record, and really didn't have a plan for the future at all, with Bill O'Brien benching Ryan Fitzpatrick after a loss to the Eagles, only for Ryan Mallett to get his shoulder mauled off, which inevitably led to Fitzception getting dragged back into the ring. And with Ryan Fitzpatrick being as confusing as usual, one game having the best football performance possible, only to turn right around and do nothing, predictably, this season didn't go anywhere, as the Houston Texans finished their first year under Bill O'Brien, going 9-7 and missing the playoffs. But as usual, there's always a little silver lining, as this season was almost a mirror image of what happened when Wade Phillips took over the defensive reins all those years ago. And now with Romeo Crennel yelling at the big strong men on defense, the Texans shot up from the 24th overall defense to the 7th, and call it luck or whatever you want, but the team greatly improved their ability to take away the football from their opponents, going from worst to first in just one season. Now, I would love to sit here and give all the praise there is to give to the coaching staff and players for a good year, but the reality is, the 2014 Texans were the victims to one of the greatest single-season carry jobs by any player ever.
And guess who? J.J. Watt.
J.J. Watt, in 2014, had, by my money, the single most efficient and dominant season any defensive player has ever had in this holy league. And just feast your eyes on a few of these stats. I mean, the screen is already filled, but his impact goes so much further than just these mind-numbing statistics. If you didn't know already, he was simply just special. But JJ could only play defense. Well, most of the time at least. And on the offensive side of the ball, the Texans began to struggle as Houston decided to trade away Fitzmagic to the Jets, who really started playing some quality football near the end of the season, and the biggest move of the offseason involved the Texans cutting Andre Johnson before the 2015 season began, and they might as well have cut Arian Foster too, because he ended up tearing his Achilles after just 4 games of play in a blowout loss where he shouldn't have even been in the game. So with those two guys down and injured, and Brian Hoyer now brought in to replace Ryan Fitzpatrick, once more the 2015 season was a repeat of last year, a 9-7 record off of the back of J.J. Watt, and this time DeAndre Hopkins, who had a monstrous 2015 campaign and already blossomed into an unguardable threat, even with Brian goddamn Hoyer throwing him the brown ball. In any normal universe, this season would be seen as nothing more than a lateral movement, but because of the historically awful division the Texans found themselves in, they were able to capitalize off of Andrew Luck's injury that season and snatch the division title to squeak into the playoffs once more. Now, although they were officially in the playoffs, they weren't really in the playoffs because nobody was taking them seriously outside of just J.J. Watt, who was still scary. And everybody, including the Texans themselves, were aware of this fact, as before the 2015 season began, Bill O'Brien himself made a speech to the entire world on Hard Knocks, just being honest, saying, "This place has no respect in the league, just so you guys are all aware of that, and no one talks about the Houston Texans because no one thinks we're going to win." That was the theme the 2015 Texans lived on. Nobody believed in them or respected them. So when they hosted a wildcard game against the Kansas City Chiefs and saw the Chiefs as favorites in their own home, they were furious and went on and let their rage out fully and got mollywopped. I mean, Jesus Christ, guys. 30-0? In this game, the opening kickoff went straight for a touchdown, and the game just spiraled out of control from there. And add on the fact that Dwayne Brown was out for this game with a leg injury, and J.J. Watt was already hampered with a groin problem, and you can easily see how Brian Hoyer and the Texans went out sad in their third home playoff game ever. Basically, yet another season under Bill O'Brien where the Texans went 9-7 and had no competent quarterback on the roster. So the Texans went out and grabbed the best free agent quarterback available and signed Brock Osweiler to a 4-year, $72 million deal. Not what I would have done, but whatever floats your boat, Bill. But as we enter the 2016 season, although there were a ton of very loud and clear critics against the signing of Brock Osweiler, myself included, hey, you gotta at least give the guy a chance, right? And when Brock Osweiler finally went under center for the first time in a Houston Texans uniform under the tutelage of the great Bill O'Brien, things really didn't go well. Turns out, Brock Osweiler was not that good at football, as the biggest highlight for him on the entire 2016 season turned out to be when he got a laser pointer jammed into his eye sockets, and later when his own crowd applauded his benching, as the man finished the season with the second lowest quarterback rating by a starting QB, right next to our pal from just 2 years prior. But even with the Texans franchise quarterback drought only continuing, due to honestly primarily pure luck, the Houston Texans went 9-7 again, winning 8 of their 9 games by 1 possession, as the Brock Osweiler-led Texans made the playoffs, even in spite of their best player J.J. Watt missing almost the entire season with a horrible back injury. So against all the odds, here we are again. The Houston Texans were in the playoffs, but still nobody respected them. And even when they won a playoff game, nobody cared at all because they defeated the Connor Cook-led Raiders, and people continued to wait until Houston could prove that they were capable of taking out a real top dog. But Texans fans knew they weren't ready for that yet. Hell, the Texans themselves knew they weren't ready for that yet either. And when the Texans moved on to the divisional round to face off against the Patriots, Thomas Brady turned in a very mediocre performance by league average standards, but it didn't even matter a little bit because Brock Osweiler is garbage, and the Patriots walked all over the Texans for the second time this decade, 34-16. So another year, another 9-7 campaign under Bill O'Brien, and we've now reached the boiling point where O'Brien's success was not equaling his respect in the locker room. And in order to regain that respect that he lost so long ago, the Texans set their eyes on one singular quarterback who could change everything for the Texans. But before we get to the mystery man, the Texans needed to drain their quarterback room and had to give up multiple draft picks and other assets just to be able to get off of Brock Osweiler's horrible contract, sending him off to purgatory. So, with yet another QB axed to the curb in the Bill O'Brien era, the Texans looked to former Dallas Cowboys quarterback Tony Romo as the man who could bring the Texans to the promised land. The Texans instantly became one of the frontrunners in the Tony Romo sweepstakes, and there were murmurings that if the Texans brought in Romo, they would become instant Super Bowl contenders, as who knows just how good DeAndre Hopkins could be with a real NFL quarterback. Everything was looking great until Tony decided to unexpectedly choose to commentate NFL games rather than play for the Houston Texans, which was probably the right decision, but still, his choice left the Texans high and dry as they were now forced to resort to their backup plan. The day is April 27th, 2017. The NFL draft had just gotten underway, and with the Houston Texans sitting at the 25th overall pick, it looked like they had no chance to draft any of the best prospects like the future Hall of Famers selected in the top 10 in Mitchell Trubisky and Patrick Mahomes. But when the Texans saw an opportunity to grab a potentially generational quarterback, they pounced on it, and they traded up to the 12th overall selection with the Cleveland Browns to grab the future of the Houston Texans in Clemson's Deshaun Watson. So although it took a lot of time, multiple different coaches, and a lot of busts, the Houston Texans finally had their first franchise quarterback since David Carr, and this time they were not going to blow this opportunity, as they immediately turned around and broke the piggy bank wide open for DeAndre Hopkins and signed the man to a massive 5-year, $80 million deal to keep DeAndre Hopkins and Deshaun Watson hopefully pretty happy. Then, as training camp came along, there wasn't much of a quarterback battle between Deshaun Watson and Tom Savage, as for some reason, Bill O'Brien came out in mid-August and announced that Tom Savage was going to be the starting quarterback by week 1. Now, don't get me wrong, we all love Tom Savage around here, of course, but the real question was, when will Deshaun Watson take this job, and how long will it take? And well, it turns out, it didn't take him very long at all.
It is going to be the rookie, Deshaun Watson, who will replace Tom Savage to start the second half.
In just week 1, Tom Savage was pulled from the game by O'Brien, and in came Deshaun Watson, who finished his first ever NFL game in solid fashion as the Texans lost to the Jaguars. But in the coming weeks, things just kept getting better and better for Deshaun, as those massages were really starting to pay off, and he had a monstrous 6-game stretch where it really looked like he had already become a star in the NFL. And with a lackluster supporting cast around him, Deshaun Watson turned in 2 incredible individual performances and came within a combined 6 points in beating both the Dynasty Patriots and the Legion of Boom Seahawks. So everything was going perfectly, and then in the span of seemingly a few days, everything fell apart. And it all started with J.J. Watt breaking his leg and ending his season, which was a massive blow to the team, and then the Texans decided to trade away longtime offensive tackle Dwayne Brown to the Seahawks after a pretty ugly meeting with the owner. And worst of all, by far, after the Texans lost to Seattle, Deshaun Watson tore his ACL in practice and was ruled out for the remainder of his rookie campaign. After all that went down in such a short amount of time, there was no salvaging this season, as without Deshaun Watson, the Texans proceeded to lose 8 of their next 9 games and finish the 2017 season with a 4-12 record. Once again, just another year and still nobody respects the Texans, and things got even bleaker for Houston fans when they heard that longtime general manager Rick Smith was stepping down from his GM position and was replaced by an O'Brien minion in Brian Gaine. And at the same time, Bill O'Brien got a massive 4-year extension, meaning he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. So, going into 2018, it was another year, another O'Brien experience, as the Texans started the year off by losing each of their first 3 games by just 1 possession, helping them to achieve their first 0-3 start in a decade. However, you cannot forget that this team had overwhelming talent, as Deshaun Watson, DeAndre Hopkins, a healthy J.J. Watt, and Jadeveon Clowney was too much for literally every team to handle, as the Texans proceeded to win 9 games in a row after digging themselves in a hole and then stamped their ticket to the playoffs by crushing the Jaguars in Week 17. Here we are again. The Texans won their division and were in a playoff game where they had a chance to prove that they could beat a team that was arguably better than them, as their opponent would be the Indianapolis Colts, a team who they had split the season series with 50-50, so this was really anyone's game. Basically, this game was expected to be close, but not even the most delusional Colts fans could have possibly dreamed of a better outcome for this game.
Deshaun Watson, playoff debut, on the wrong end of it.
God damn it, Houston. When? When are you going to go out and grab the respect that you so desperately want? The final score says 21-7, but this game was practically over for 3 quarters, as Andrew Luck and Marlon Mack plastered Houston against the wall and barely even broke a sweat in the process. So, with yet another season of failing to make even an AFC Championship appearance, instead of going back to the drawing board, this was the very moment where everything fell apart for for the Texans. This was it. This was Bill O'Brien's last chance to salvage his time in Houston, as he had done nothing but fail to win when it mattered most as the coach of the Texans. So what was Houston's first move of the offseason that decided the fate of this franchise? Well, it was to give Bill O'Brien even more power. The Houston Texans decided to fire their general manager / puppet Brian Gaines and replaced him with absolutely nobody, allowing the butt chin to take all duties of personal activities within the Texans front office and had a huge say in the future transactions the Texans would make. This was quite literally the worst decision the Texans as an organization could make, because at this point, O'Brien could have been fired at any time, so he was going to do everything to keep his job he could, and proved that by making 2 desperate trades by getting rid of Jadeveon Clowney on a contract year, I guess, and sending 2 future first-round picks away to the Miami Dolphins in exchange for left tackle Laremy Tunsil. Now, don't get me wrong, Laremy Tunsil is a guy who knows his way around a gas mask, and he's also just a straight-up dog. So although it was very important to beef up the O-line after Deshaun Watson ended up getting sacked more than any other player in the league last year, even with that, many people began to question if Bill O'Brien actually had the team's best intentions in mind. And to find out whether these decisions actually paid off or not, we have to look at the Texans' 2019 season, the most cruel season in Texans history, where the tone of this campaign was set on just the very first game of the season. It's week 1, Monday Night Football, the Houston Texans versus the New Orleans Saints, a game between the NFL's quarterback past and the future, and the fireworks between these two did not disappoint one bit.
Breeze with time to the end zone!
The two teams went back and forth all game, locked in hand-to-hand combat until Deshaun Watson continued to show how special he was by getting drilled while laying a dime straight into Kenny Still's breadbasket to take the lead. So now, this was the situation. 1 football, 1 Drew Brees, 1 timeout, and 37 seconds left in the game. The Texans just needed to prevent Brees from working his magic again for 1 more possession. But they couldn't, as the Saints went straight down the field and won the game 30-28 off of a game-winning 58-yard field goal. Throughout the year, not only were these cardiac games very common for Houston, but to make it worse, they were sprinkled in with some baffling wins as well, as they had embarrassing games like a Week 4 loss to Kyle Allen and the Panthers, and a near loss to the Gardner Minshew-led Jaguars, but they also had incredible wins against the eventual Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs and the Raiders off of an insane Deshaun Watson play. Regardless, the Houston Texans finished the 2019 season going 10-6 and ended up beating Tennessee out for the division title once more, and in the wild card, all those inconsistencies boiled over in a game against the Buffalo Bills where the Texans fell behind 16-0 at one point, but managed to rally behind the incredible play of Deshaun Watson and came back to beat the Bills in overtime with a walk-off field goal. It was admittedly a great moment and a cool game overall, but it was still just the wild card. And now with the Texans pouring all their eggs into the basket that was this 2019 season, they now had 1 more chance to finally break free of their mold and earn the respect of the NFL world for the first time ever, as they had a divisional round matchup with the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, the Chiefs were the better team, and all the Texans honestly had to do was go in there and show a little bit of heart and bow out with their dignity still intact. But that, for some reason, didn't happen, and to open up the game, the Texans dominated.
Out of the gun on 2nd and goal. Across the middle, it is caught by Fells.
With Deshaun Watson completely in the zone and the team as a whole getting a few lucky breaks, in the second quarter, the Texans held a 24-0 lead against the immortal Kansas City Chiefs. You could not have imagined a more perfect start to this game for the Texans. And then after the Chiefs scored an inevitable touchdown, Bill O'Brien dialed up the biggest gamble of the day, which turned out to be arguably the worst call he'd ever make, as Houston went with a fake punt on 4th and 4, which didn't even come close. And that was the exact point where the floodgates were open. The Texans' public execution was basically held, as O'Brien's conservative play calls when they had their lead came back to bite them, and the Texans could only muster penalties and touchdowns on the wrong side of the field for pretty much the entire rest of the game, as the Kansas City Chiefs defeated the Houston Texans 51-31. The Houston Texans as a franchise died on that very day. Not only did they not have any respect around the league still, but they were now being laughed at, and the nightmare would only continue as just days later, the Texans would officially announce Bill O'Brien, the man who had yet to make a single AFC Championship appearance as a coach in a division where literally every other team besides Houston had at least made one, was officially named the general manager and the head coach of the Texans going forward. And when Bill was given full control of the decision-making process, the first thing he did was trade away DeAndre Hopkins, a top 5 player in franchise history in the prime of his career, away to the Arizona Cardinals for a few late-round picks and David Johnson's rotting carcass. As the trade went through and DeAndre Hopkins left for Arizona, so did whatever remained of the Houston Texans' soul, as they had allowed Bill O'Brien to rise through the ranks in the shadows like he was Palpatine or something to gain full control over the organization. And this entire team was now at the mercy of a man whose ego had grown far too big to control. Basically put, there is no God, only O'Brien. Bill, with his new power, then handed out massive multi-year deals to both Laramie Tunsil and Deshaun Watson, and with that, the 2020 NFL season would begin, and it started off on a disastrous note, as the Texans lost their first 3 games to respectable teams, and then dropped their 4th game in a row to the winless Minnesota Vikings, 23-31. But then, it finally happened. After this awful start, the Houston Texans actually did it. They fired their dictator, head coach, and general manager, Bill O'Brien, freeing them from the man's iron fist forever. So although Bill was finally gone, they still had to face the wrath of the damage that already had been done. And from 2020 to 2022, the Houston Texans have had the worst record by any team in the league, barely winning over double-digit games in a combined 3-season sample size. The few remaining fans of the Texans were subjected to watch their franchise quarterback melt down and turn into nothing more than a monster, their best player in franchise history, J.J. Watt, leaving them, and all of their talent they gathered over the last half a decade amount to nothing. So here we are today, where the Houston Texans have been unanimously considered the worst team in the NFL for years. But to their credit, the Texans have started to reassemble a young core to lead Houston into the future, and although success may be the Texans' eventual fate, the past is inescapable, and the Houston Texans' past is nothing but a legacy of failure. Anyways, if you like this video, then subscribe, because I already have a ton of documentaries on the channel, and I think you'd like them. And you should probably watch this video right here if you haven't already, on the Killer Bees trio and all the factors that led to them not winning a Super Bowl. It's pretty good, trust me. Anyways, until next time.